What's the saddest thing you've ever seen in public? It happened to me yesterday. I'm a stay-at-home dad, and I was dropping my son off at kindergarten. One of the other moms there has 4 kids, and her second one is in my son's class. As we were about to leave, I saw the mom of 4 with her baby strapped to her, and her 2-year-old son was having a tantrum about walking home. I gave her the "we've all been there, stay strong" look that parents give each other. So the mom says to the kid, "Why don't you go home with him? He looks like he wants you." My initial reaction was, "Hey, don't drag me into your drama," but I understand her frustration. I bent down to be eye level with the kid, and I said, "Yeah, for sure. I've got some dryer vents. I can use some small arms to help me clean." The joke was obviously lost on the kid, but the mom thought it was hilarious. Anyway, the kid opens his arm like he wants a hug, so whatever, I give him a hug. Then he clings to me for like 5 minutes. I've said maybe 5 words to this kid in my life, and he's golding on to me like he's afraid of falling down. His mom says, "I think he misses his dad." I'm like, "Is he away?" And she says, "No, he's just not a hugger. Neither am I." So this poor kid would go willingly into the arms of a stranger because his parents don't hug him enough. That was sad as hell. In Soho in NYC, laying directly on the ground against one of the luxury stores there, I think it was Prada or Gucci, was a homeless boy who must have been in his early teenage years, face down on the sidewalk sleeping. Dead of winter, he was so dirty and looked so cold, and the juxtaposition of such extreme poverty right beside absurd wealth was horrendous. Back in 2011, my mom had just been diagnosed with breast cancer, and I was at the hospital with her during the 2 weeks of her surgery and recovery. Each day, I would see a homeless woman hanging around the hospital to get some sleep and warmth instead of being outside. She made a huge impact on me, and when I could work, bring her food and hot drinks. I was at the lowest time of my life, and so was she. In the years since then, I would always try and find her when I was back in the area. It's not that far from me, maybe 45 minutes or so I would make a plan to try and find her. I did sometimes over the years. She didn't recognize me, and I didn't add it to the conversation. But even now, when I'm back in that same hospital because my mom now has stage 4 cancer, I can't stop thinking about her. She's always on my mind, even 13 years later. She's still in the same position, and I'm back there again too. This happened a while ago, back when I was still talking to my stepfather. He and I would play tennis semi-regularly at my high school's courts. We were driving back from that one day, driving up Main Street of our city. He swerved so that he wouldn't hit a nest with a baby bird in it. We debated it back and forth for maybe 15 seconds before deciding that we needed to turn back around to go and at least get the nest off the road. When we came back, the nest was pulverized and there was a red smear on the road. We figured one of the cars behind us hit the nest before we could turn around. It was a sadness that he and I both shared. As far as I know, he never told my mom about it. I certainly never told anyone. They divorced last year, and because of how that went down, he and I are no longer speaking. But I think about the dead baby bird a lot, and I wonder if he does too. I can't ever ask him about it now, and it feels so lonely to shoulder. I was walking through the city after a rainstorm when I saw a man sitting on the sidewalk, soaked, with a small sign that read, "Anything helps." His hands shook from the cold, but he didn't ask for anything, just stared at the ground. People passed by without a glance, busy with their lives, while he sat there, shivering and invisible. The contrast struck me. Everyone moving on with their day, and him, alone in his struggle, unnoticed. Public. At work, I worked at different pharmacies for approximately 10 years. Many sad stories, but the ones that really stuck are the ones where parents had to take a second look at their sick child to see if they really needed the medicine after hearing the price. Pensiface I am from Denmark, where everyone without a job can collect a certain minimum income. It's higher if you have children, and then you also get subsidies and benefits for them. You also get reimbursed for your medicine. The more you need to spend, the more is reimbursed. For adults, the first approximate €140, you have to pay 100% yourself, and then after that you start getting 50% reimbursed, then there's a next level and so on. For children under the age of 18, they start at 0 DKK/euro, and right at the start get 60% reimbursed. But still, parents are struggling to pay, and it is the children who are suffering. Pensiface, I can only imagine how it is in less fortunate countries. My squadron commander in the Air Force, in the late 1970s, was a young female captain. One afternoon, her husband was killed when his F-4 jet fighter crashed during a training exercise, but for about an hour she could not be reached. She was deliberating at a court-martial. I saw her return, park her car, walk into the building with her normal cheery gait, innocent and oblivious to the terrible news she would hear in less than a minute. Edit. A clarification. I was not the one to deliver the tragic news. The wing commander delivers the news in these circumstances, an all too familiar routine. During my 4 years assigned to that wing, There were 10 fatalities in training accidents. Went on a class trip to Washington, D.C. when I was in high school. We were at the crosswalk of a very busy street, and an older woman, 60s to 70s maybe, and a roughly 10 to 12-year-old girl were crossing the street coming towards us. The older woman motioned for the child to run ahead, and just as the child reached the sidewalk, the older woman was hit by a car. She went up in the air and fell flat on the ground face first. The little girl turns and sees her on the ground, yells out "Momo," and runs toward her. Happened over 20 years ago, and I'll never forget it. A few days ago, I was at a tourist attraction, and a little boy asked his family if he could see some pumpkins. The mom then got pissed at the boy and started spanking him, making him scream. When my family got to our car a few minutes later, we could still hear him screaming. All that spanking just for wanting to see some pumpkins. One of the saddest was in 1997, Beanie Baby Day at Tropicana Field in St. Pete, FL. Long lines and roasting hot. Dad gets out of line and takes his 8-year-old son down by a tree and slaps him cold-clocked right in the face like you would another man. I can still see it so perfectly in my 11-year-old mind. The kid looked broken and like he was used to it. I hope he's okay now. P.U.S. Dad. My family was driving to another family member's house for Thanksgiving, and it was a blink-and-miss moment, but we drove past an old woman sobbing on the side of the road next to her parked car. She was trying to retrieve her cat's body from the road because the poor thing got hit. My parents were busy bickering about the GPS, so they didn't notice, and I was too timid to say anything. I don't even know what happened exactly. Walking to work, I passed a couple dressed for office work sitting on a retainer wall outside a diagnostic clinic. The girl was crying her eyes out, and the guy had a 1,000-yard stare. Seeing them actually made me make some lifestyle changes because I did not want to be sitting on that wall. The saddest thing I've ever seen in public was a homeless woman sitting on the street holding a sign asking for help while everyone just walked past like she wasn't even there. It broke my heart because it felt like she was invisible to everyone, and I couldn't stop thinking about how hard her life must be. It made me realize how easy it is to forget about the struggles others face every day. I was living in the Tenderloin in San Francisco. I parked my car in a garage that was about a block and a half from my actual apartment. It was right across the street from the Glide Church in a very unsavory neighborhood. I saw a lot on that daily short walk home, but the worst was when I saw a crackhead woman leaning into a car window with a little girl no more than 6 years old attached to her arm crying, and speaking to the man in the driver's seat about how long he could take her in his car for. It was clear she was trading time with the little girl for money or drugs. I called 911, and they hung up on me as I was telling them what I saw, and they said, 911 is for life or death emergencies, only disappointed face. I was on lunch break from work. I had limited time and had to run an errand by going down the street to a nearby Walgreens. The parking lot of this store forced you to drive past the entrance to the building before you could turn into the lot. This meant being at the mercy of customers coming and going. Sure enough, just as I'm about to leave, I get stuck waiting for the oldest, frieliest man I've ever seen crossing the driveway. If it wasn't for the shopping cart, I don't think he could stand under his own strength. I was in a hurry and getting mad at how long he was taking, but then I saw what was in his cart. A single roll of toilet paper. This man doesn't expect to live long enough to use a whole pack. Put my problems into perspective real quick. I had a pretty dark childhood. There's been dissociation involved. One day at work, I saw a child walking around with her parent and made eye contact with her. She had this look on her face of confusion, sadness, almost like a daze. What happened in that child's life. And I'd like to think maybe nothing happened, or maybe just someone she loved passed away, or maybe it was just an odd moment. But for some reason, a single moment of eye contact jolted me with an emotional memory/emotional flashback, and I just sincerely hope nothing bad was happening to that girl. An old friend of mine, my sister's boyfriend, and his friend running after my old friend's dog who had gotten out. They lived across the street from me, and we live right next to a busy road. They were yelling for him and running as fast as possible to catch up to him. He made it to the busy road. I heard tires screeching, a yelp, yelling, and then watched as they carried his body back to their house while they all cried. It all happened so quickly that I couldn't even process it or try to help. All I could do was watch and listen. I can still see and hear it all years later. Saw a deer that had been hit by a vehicle. Must have broken its back. It was laying on its stomach with its head upright by the side of the road. It seemed completely alert, but it couldn't move at all. Traffic was heavy, and the look of sheer terror in that deer's eyes as the cars whizzed past will haunt me until I die. I've never seen something look that frightened before. I was driving a delivery route at the time and didn't come back the same way. So I don't know what happened to it, but I pray that someone stopped and put it out of its misery. That's been 30 years ago, and it still crushes me every time it pops into my head. I was waiting for a doctor in the emergency room. On the other side of the curtain was an older man, 60-ish, and his wife. The man was yellow with jaundice, obviously super sick. A nurse entered their area and began to explain that the hospital had a 3-day alcohol detox program, just to get you through the first few days of withdrawal. When the nurse left, the couple began discussing options. I distinctly heard the wife say, "I had to do it. It sucked, but I'm better off for it," obviously talking about the detox. The husband said he wouldn't do it and didn't need to. He then left the emergency room. The look on that woman's face absolutely crushed me. She loves her husband and doesn't want him to be sick and die. I hope he changes his mind. There is nothing worse than alcoholic in their last days. I work security. Last winter, on a very cold and rainy day, I came across an elderly transient. His name was Thomas. Thomas told me he couldn't get up because he couldn't feel his legs. I contacted SACFD, and he got a ride to the hospital. SAC Fire left his belongings behind. It was all Thomas had. I put them in a nearby bike locker. About a week later, Thomas popped up on my site. He cried when I told him that had his stuff. Here's the sad part for me. About 2 days after that, Thomas showed up again with a knife. It was still in the packaging, and it was a gift for me. I wanted to cry. Here's a guy who has nothing, no home, no job, clothes full of holes and mud. And he's giving me a gift. I tried to tell him to return it for the money's back, but he got angry and made me take it. I reluctantly did. Thomas hasn't been around since, but I hope he's well. I was at a walk-up fast food place. I was sitting down eating ice cream with my husband when an older woman walked past me to the garbage can. I watched her as she started to go through the garbage looking for food. She found some food and took it with her further down where there were more tables. So I went down to where she was and offered to buy her a meal. It wasn't much, but at least she didn't have to eat someone's leftovers at one time. One time, I saw an elderly man sitting alone at a park bench, holding a bouquet of flowers and looking at his watch over and over. He waited there for what felt like hours before eventually leaving with the flowers still in his hand. It really hit me that he was probably waiting for someone who never showed up. It was one of those moments that just stays with you. There was a pair of ducks living by the roadside close to where I live. Someone had kindly made a road sign asking drivers to take care as they were nesting. When I was driving past one morning, I saw that the female duck had been run over. Her body was being pecked at by a bunch of crows while her mate stood back and watched helplessly. Saw a guy run across the road to catch a bus, only to be hit by a taxi. I just remember the guy on the floor, wailing in pain like some sort of animal, and the taxi driver getting out of his car and just repeatedly saying, "I didn't see him," whilst breaking down crying, almost like he was pleading with the people who came to help to believe that he was innocent. My friend and I were both only 15, 16 at the time. We wanted to help, but the adults who were around insisted on us leaving because we were only kids. So we walked on in silence to where we were going. We legit didn't talk until we got to where we were going because we were both so shaken up. I felt awful for that taxi driver the rest of the day. Maybe not the saddest, but the most pathetic and sad. An elderly nun was standing on her stoop, trying to figure out how to get down the stairs to her waiting cab. I was 4 cars back, and a bunch of cars were backing up behind me because the cabbie did nothing. I kept waiting for him to get out to help, but no. This was also on one of the biggest and busiest streets in the city. So I put my hazards on, walked past the 4 cars and the cabbie in front of me, and up to the nun. I asked her if I could guide her to the cab, and she agreed, which took all of maybe 2 minutes. I often wonder how long everyone was willing to wait to help this elderly nun, particularly the cabbie, before helping. Absolutely pathetic. There was a homeless man I saw on my commute pretty regularly. He had started getting cleaned up and looking healthier, and got a job. Then I didn't see him for a while, and I was so happy thinking he was able to get off the streets. A few months later I saw him again, looking worse than I had ever seen. Skinnier, missing teeth. I was so sad, he was so kind. I hope he was able to get clean again. Addiction is no joke. 2009, right in the thick of the Great Recession. Lots of local factories either put operations on an extended hiatus or shut down entirely. 15% unemployment in my city, and I was so fortunate to have a restaurant job. Was walking home one day and saw a visibly panicked man in his mid-20s being detained by 2 plainclothes security officers, one on each arm, in a pharmacy parking lot, just screaming his head off. I was wondering why, but then I saw the full duffel bag at the man's feet crammed full of baby formula. He was screaming, "The factory closed, please let me go. I have kids to feed." I just quickly shuffled away and tried not to cry. This was back 1988, long before the homeless crisis. My friend and I spent a night just walking around downtown Seattle. It was late October, as dawn broke. We were down towards the south of core downtown, and I see a man and woman in an alcove, a piece of clear plastic sheeting wrapped around them to stay warm. They shifted, and that's when I saw their child laying down between them, maybe 3 or 4 years old at the most. This image is still seared into my memory. I was so heartbroken and so shocked that it was even possible. It still brings a tear to my eye. We went to San Francisco a couple of years ago, and we were standing by a 5-star hotel. Outside the hotel, there was a public bin, and there was a homeless man searching for food in it. Really stuck with me, the massive divides between rich and poor in the US and how they can stand side by side sometimes. Went to the vet clinic with our guinea pig. WHOUN, we got out of the car, a girl, and her mom was leaving the building with a pet carrier in her hands. She was bawling her eyes out and kept shouting, "It's not fair." I don't know what happened, but she looked absolutely devastated. Another time at another vet, saw a girl in the waiting room with a small carrier. We started talking. It was her hedgehog. I don't remember what was wrong with him, but he seemed mostly fine, and I tried to reassure her that it's probably going to be okay. She was called in, then about 15 minutes later, she left the examination room sobbing. She told me her hedgehog has cancer and doesn't have much time left. He just hit it well. My dad had major surgery. He wasn't expected to survive. I was all anxious and scared and took a trip to the hospital to see him in recovery. As I walked in, a woman come running in with 2 other ladies waiting at the hospital, and she screamed in the lobby, "He's burned everywhere, and there isn't a spot he isn't burned on." The scream was so heartbreaking. I had my own situation, but I still remember that scream. My dad was okay, and later I asked my mom about it. She said all the nurses were frantic, and they didn't even touch the patient. They asked for a medical helicopter without even looking at him. It was so bad. They were all talking about it. It was a 4-year-old boy. My situation turned out great, so I prayed for that little boy. About 5 weeks later, they had this family on the local news. The little boy grabbed boiling water and spilled it on himself. The boy had not one mark on him, not one burn. His clothing protected him somehow. It was an absolute miracle. The nurses seen his cloths melted and were afraid to touch him, so they just air-lighted him to a children's hospital without really looking. No one wanted to touch him, so they assumed he burned, but he didn't. I still remember his mom screaming, but I was so happy to see that outcome. Driving back from work, a few vehicles parked on both shoulders in a 60 miles per hour area with a few residential streets on either side. No emergency vehicles on scene yet, but I slowed down and saw in the following order: a child's bike with the front wheel bent badly, then 2 adults doing compressions in the tall grass, and next to them, a man with both arms stretched up, pleading to the sky. I cried for a whole hour after this. I passed by that little girl's cross on the side of the road twice a day and always think of her and her parents. Please consider subscribing if you enjoyed. Love.